Milei's speech at the Argentine Central Bank in 2024, in English in his own voice through the magic of computers. This is a very technical speech that assumes a listener has a thorough background in economics. Please forgive any errors in translation. The speech has three parts: the economy that Milei inherited, the diagnosis of the problems, and the policies that they implemented to solve these.
It was easier. I had accessories, so I'm going to use them.
Era más fácil, tenía accesorios. Así que los voy a usar.
Good afternoon. First of all, thank you very much to Vladimir. Thank you very much to Santiago for allowing me to be part of these days.
Bueno, buenas tardes. En primer lugar, muchas gracias a Vladimir, muchas gracias a Santiago por permitirme ser parte de esta jornada.
Thank you very much to each of you who are here and who are interested in this huge work that the central bank is doing together with the colossus that we have as Minister of Economy, Toto Capito, and the textbooks will remember him as the best Minister of Economy in Argentine history.
A ese coloso que tenemos como Ministro de Economía, que es Toto Caputo, y que los libros de texto lo recordarán como el mejor Ministro de Economía de la historia argentina.
The presentation that I am going to do consists of three parts. In the first part, I will be describing the inheritance that we received.
Que voy a hacer consta de tres partes. En una primera parte voy a estar describiendo la herencia, qué fue lo que recibimos.
In the second part, I will be discussing the diagnosis and the fundamental role that the good economic theory has to precisely solve this type of problem.
Clave fundamental que tiene la buena teoría económica para justamente resolver este tipo de problemas.
And in the last part of the presentation, I will be discussing the implemented policies and the results that we are achieving and what we are expecting in the future.
Sobre las políticas implementadas y los resultados que estamos consiguiendo y qué es lo que estamos esperando hacia adelante.
In that sense, regarding the inheritance, one of the things that blew our mind, which was truly overwhelming, was what was happening with the inflation rate at the beginning of December.
Una de las cosas que nos rompía los ojos, que era verdaderamente estremecedor, era lo que estaba pasando con la tasa de inflación durante el inicio del mes de diciembre.
When we looked at the inflation rate of the first week, the daily inflation rate was at 1%. If you look at that, you can see that the inflation rate was going up to 3,700% by year.
Lo anualizaban, implicaba que la inflación venía viajando al 3.700%.
These numbers that I am going to be provide seem exaggerated, but when I explain them, the budgetary imbalance that would have cemented these in, there would have been monetary pressure that would have allowed this to spiralize and go on.
Hubiera habido convalidación monetaria que hubiera permitido que esto se espiralizara y siguiera para adelante.
When you look at the first 2 weeks of December, the rate was already at 1.2%. That is, it had accelerated, and that in annual terms was 7,700.
Al 1,2% diario, es decir, se había acelerado y eso en términos anualizados era 7.700.
On the other hand, we had concrete data of what was the inflation rate for the month of December at low prices, that is, at consumer prices, which was 25.5%, and that in annual terms is close to.
En precios al consumidor, que fue del 25,5%, y eso en términos anualizados está cerca de...
I don't have the microphones well positioned because I'm hitting them all the time. So I select the glasses or I select the microphones. So if you hear weird things, it's because I hit the microphones. It was an inflation rate that was traveling at 1,500%, but if you take it in capital goods, at 54% annualized gives 17,000%. That is, we were on the brink of a macroeconomic collapse. In addition, it was not only thing we were seeing as a symptom of this problem of the inflation rate that was accelerating, but there were also the initial imbalances that would provide monetary validation that would validate inflation precisely.
Lo que eran los desequilibrios de inicio que podían dar la convalidación monetaria que convalidara la inflación precisamente.
Basically, we had imbalances of the three worst major crises in Argentine history.
Peores grandes crisis de la historia argentina.
On the one hand, we had a surplus of money in the famous money overhang, which was twice what we had in Rodriguez's previous one.
Del que teníamos en la previa del Rodrigazo.
In fact, we are publishing a note in The Economist. The Economist people asked us for this estimate.
Dando una nota en The Economist y justamente la gente de The Economist nos pidió.
Luckily, Federico's team took over from that glasses that I also have as Minister of Regulation, that luxury, which is Dr. Federico Sturzenegger with his team.
Como ministro de Regulación, ese lujo que es el doctor Federico Sturzenegger con su
They did the estimation of money overhang, and it was precisely twice what we had in 1975, that is, what Rodriguez's previous one was.
75, es decir, lo que era
Why is this important?
¿Por qué es importante?
Because the inflation in Rodriguez's previous one was 30%, and when Rodriguez's price jumps to 180%, that is, the inflation rate multiplied by 6.
180%, es decir, se multiplicó por 6 la tasa de inflación.
If we came in with inflation of the order of 200%, clearly multiplying by 6, it would imply jumping at levels of 1200%, but if the imbalance was double, it would imply at least jumping to 2400.
Pero si el desequilibrio era el doble, implicaba por lo menos estar saltando al 2400.
On the other hand, we had an additional problem, which was the situation of the central bank in terms of remunerated passives.
El Banco Central, en términos de pasivos remunerados,
The remunerated passive relationship on the monetary base was at around 4 times.
estaba en torno a 4 veces.
That situation is even worse than the one we had in the previous one, the hyperinflation of 1989, with monetary base levels in terms of GDP similar to those of the time,
Área en términos de PBI similares a los de ese momento.
with which the fall in money demand would have implicated strongly and very easily to go to hyperinflationary levels. At the peak of the hyperinflation, the monetary base in terms of GDP fell to 0.2%.
El PBI cayó a 0,2%.
Therefore, and in the hyperinflation of 1989, we had an inflation of 5,000%.
Una inflación del 5000%.
This was also aggravated by the fact that we had a set of remunerated pesos that beat 30, 60, 90 up to 270 days.
Que vencían a 30, 60, 90, así hasta 270 días.
And the previous government, unintentionally, this was Nakaso, passed all those policies in one day.
Esto no fue casual. Pasó todas esas posiciones a un día.
Therefore, we had a bomb about to explode in one day.
A un día.
That is, this would double the amount of money in one day.
En un día.
Basically, the bet of the previous government was that they did not believe that we were libertarian liberals.
En realidad, ellos no creían que nosotros éramos liberales, libertarios.
In reality, we are libertarian liberals.
Libertarados.
In fact, in the public debate, they were going to find quite a few libertarians. That in the name of freedom, if we had done that, we would have generated the precipitation of hyperinflation.
Hecho eso, hubiéramos generado la precipitación de la hiperinflación.
Fairnism would have taken all its outposts on the streets. It would have taken over supermarkets.
La calle nos hubieran saqueado supermercados.
That dynamic, which we already saw during 2001-2002, with the coup d'etat of Ancini and Duo de la UG,
Dual de la Rúa.
a coup that ended and the Sacris ended, let's say, when Jodi arrived in power. That was what they had planned. Therefore, not only would we have generated hyperinflation, we would have led the situation.
Llevado la situación, si ustedes
When you look at the jumps in poverty, both in 2001-2002 and in 1989-1990, the jump in poverty would have involved going to levels of at least 90% of the poor and 50% of the homeless.
50% indigentes, una verdad.
It is a real calamity. And not only the damage, but also the populists who have finished killing any spark of a liberal solution.
Terminado de matar cualquier atisbo de una solución liberal
Because what worries the political party the most
al partido de la política, ¿sí? Que en realidad ahí están todos, está todo
or the political caste, which is the party if the state is to be in power.
el partido del Estado, es estar en el poder.
But if they also make them pay the cost to others, it is a party for them.
Fiesta para ellos.
That is what they were hoping for us to burst everything very quickly and return to power by January,
Y volver al poder ya para enero,
when all the imbalances were cleared, to blame all this on us.
cargarnos todo esto a nosotros
to kill the cycle of recovery and enter an endless cycle of populism. Also, there was the aggravating factor that we had social indicators that were worse than the ones we had in 2001. At the same time, we had an imbalance of flows, the fiscal deficit. That is, the Treasury and the Central Bank reached 15 points of the GDP. 5 were in the Treasury and 10 were generated in the Central Bank, which is the quasi-fiscal deficit. And at times the gap was changing. It was around 200%. That is why I am grateful for the comment of some analysts saying, Milei devalued. If the gap was 200% and the net international reserves were negative at almost $12 billion, I did not devalue. That is, the devaluation was already there. That is, it was only a matter of sincerity. But we did not only have the problem of these flow imbalances, we also had stock imbalances. As I mentioned, we had negative international reserves at about $12 billion. We had debt in the central bank between the zero and the dividends caught at about $50 billion. We had debts in basis of the immediate eviction for the equivalent of $90 billion. We had debt in foreign currency evicting for $25 billion, which a large part of that debt was with the International Monetary Fund. But we had the program down, and this is also interesting because in general, when one has a situation of recurrent evictions, recomposing that situation with the fund can take between 3 and 6 months. And the reality is that the economic program was so solid at the end of the week. The International Monetary Fund gave us the opportunity to move forward. Obviously, it did it with repairs. It did it with repairs that many thought was impossible to reach a deficit of zero. We proposed to reach the deficit zero in 2024, that is, when it ended in 2024. I remember that many domestic economists said that it was impossible to make an adjustment of more than 1 point of the GDP, that it was crazy, and all the epithets associated with that about my person, and especially about the fact of riding a motorcycle. But we demonstrated in the end. We proved the consistency of our program. And the truth is that the goals were much more ambitious than the one proposed by the International Monetary Fund. Therefore, it worked out very quickly. And the reality is that what seemed impossible to achieve in a year, we achieved in a month. That is, Argentina, which in the last 123 years had a deficit during 113. And the years that it did not have a deficit was because it was in default. In the first month of management, the deficit zero was achieved. I achieved that. We have not abandoned it. We are not going to abandon this year, and the law that we sent for the budget includes the deficit zero basis for the first time in Argentine history. And we are going to fulfill it, and we are going to resist everything that we have to resist. Because when we had to put what we had to put on the table, playing it for the tax balance in the face of sensitive causes, where populists wanted to break the balance of public accounts, we did what we had to do, regardless of the impact that that could have on my image. Because I did not come here to take care of my image and have a political life. I came to fix the problems of Argentina. And I am willing to pay all the costs that I have to pay. And if I have to veto the retirees, if I have to veto the liars who defend their jobs to the figure of the universities, with great lies, I'm going to do it. because my commitment to the tax balance is unwavering, and so I did.
Así lo hice.
Thank you. Naturally, with all the problems that we had, there was also the problem of the pits. But you will remember what that part of the discussion was.
Esa parte de la discusión.
Therefore, that was what we were facing.
Que nos encontrábamos
We were facing a catastrophe. We needed to react strongly, quickly.
a fuerte, rápido.
Fortunately, we had been working on an economic program
Nosotros veníamos trabajando en un programa económico
to have a very strong consistency relationship.
de consistencia muy fuerte.
And well, let's say we are taming this wild boar.
Estamos domando a este toro salvaje.
So, now for the second part of this presentation, the diagnosis.
La presentación tiene que ver con el diagnóstico.
I mean, this plays a very important role in what one believes in terms of economic theory
Cree en términos de teoría económica.
and the consequences in terms of economic policy. I mean, I know that some parts are very basic for
Partes son como muy básicas para, digamos,
a large part of the skull is tea sitting here,
de las eminencias que están sentadas aquí.
and I apologize for having to repeat such simple things.
Cosas simples en algunas
But there is also a wider audience and there are students,
y hay estudios
and I think some concepts are worth repeating or taking into account.
refrescarlos o tenerlos en cuenta.
And some things should come by abbreviation,
Y algunas cosas también debería ser bueno que la tengamos
even for professionals and the very prestigious,
eh,
because it is the foundation on which we think about this problem.
este problema.
We are convinced about the monetary nature of inflation.
Estamos convencidos sobre la naturaleza monetaria de la inflación.
That is, inflation for us is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon
Nosotros es siempre y en todo lugar un fenómeno
generated by an excess of money supply,
de dinero,
either because the supply goes up or because the demand falls, or because both things happen at the same time,
eso genera
and that generates a loss of the purchasing power of money. That is, and all the prices expressed in monetary units go up. That is our diagnosis.
Ahora,
Now, given this background,
además, uno, digamos, dado toda esta discusión,
as we are proposing this,
porque así como estamos nosotros proponiendo esto,
there are other professionals who consider that inflation is multifaceted
causal,
and all that kind of thing. The truth is that they are hypotheses to which I did not adhere,
eh,
but that is part of another discussion.
yo les vengo
I come to tell you how we see it,
nosotros que es lo que
what we are doing, and then those who really understand,
los que entienden
who end up writing the story as it unfolds.
escribiendo la historia como corresponde. Entonces,
The question is, where does this hypothesis come from?
bueno, ¿de dónde sale esta hipótesis?
I mean, how do we look at this problem?
Entonces,
From my point of view, the first thing we have to do
lo que hay que hacer
is to not define inflation
es definir la inflación como la
as the increase in prices, but the loss of purchasing power of money. Because if the problem is the increase in prices,
generalizada de precios,
the usual pitfalls appear,
las de siempre,
which have been failing for more than 4,000 years,
de controlar
trying to control prices. The margin that this has an associated problem of value theory, of believing that prices are a margin over costs.
un margen sobre los costos, es
I mean, a problem of the objective theory of value,
ayuda al valor
a theory that was defeated in 1871 with the appearance of Menger,
de Menger,
when he wrote his Principles of Economy and Politics.
de política,
And he also did it in parallel with William Stanley Jevons and with Leon Warres. I wanted to mention Warres. Can you imagine why?
¿por qué?
Leon. But apart from that,
Al margen de eso, entonces,
one should think, how would the world be without money?
sería el mundo sin dinero.
Well, the world without money, we study it. It is usually studied in the last part of the models,
Modelos de
of the microcourses, the general equilibrium part,
cambio general,
which are the model of money.
modelos de trueque.
So now the problem is that you, in a money economy,
Ustedes en una economía de
find yourself with two great non-minor issues.
cuestiones no menores.
One is the problem of double coincidence.
Coincidencias,
That is, that you find someone who wants
que quiere,
what you have to sell.
tienen para vender
It is simultaneous that that person has what you want.
quieren.
I mean, which is a non-minor problem. But even when you find that counterpart, there is also a problem of indivisibility. That is, I like bread, I eat bread. And I find myself with a baker, but probably I am not willing to give a lecture for a kilo of bread, and the amount of kilos of bread that would imply a lecture of mine, at least now. And I hope to do things well, so that we can live from this when I finish my political career. Given that I have given up my privilege to be the first in history. The truth is that I don't need so much bread. So all this, if one truly takes it seriously, and this would lead to a huge loss of transactions, and therefore we would have a fall of truly abrupt file warfare. Therefore, note that he will not believe where I am going to get this reference. But this reference is from John Robinson. He said that when the topics of money neutrality were analyzed, they were not well thought out, because the economy of the currency is not the same as the economy of the currency, and that is not a minor issue. Now, in the face of the situation, one has to understand how money appears. And in reality, let's say, it is not that individuals began to cry because they could not make transactions, and they were suffering for life, because they tried to find the solution. And one of the things they discovered was that there were some goods that were exchanged more than others. So one of the things they discovered was that if they went and bought that good that was exchanged more, it would serve them indirectly to buy what they wanted definitively. In other words, in reality, money is an indirect exchange good that is used to make transactions. So, for example, when man was nomadic, the most important thing in the history of humanity was to eat. So things related to food were important. So nomadic men made money, let's say, and they had money, if you want, as an indirect exchange good, and it was precisely cattle. These cattle, as an indirect exchange good. Now, then man became sedentary, and one of the things he ate a lot was bread. And bread is made with wheat. So they began to make transactions in wheat, not because they wanted to have wheat, not because they wanted to accumulate wheat, not because they wanted to have a lot of wheat, but actually they wanted to use it as an indirect exchange good. In that sense, you have different currencies, such as wheat, coffee, tobacco. I always find it very funny at a Milton Friedman conference that talks about hyperinflation in Germany. He says, if he eats nails, and at one point he says, if he eats connect, and he says, it was the most liquid money definition I've ever found. So if you look, all these goods play two roles that money must play, which is to be a unit of account and to be a means of generalized payment. But the problem with these goods is that it's like ice cream. Not so violent, but it's like ice cream. It doesn't have a negative interest rate. I mean, if you don't eat ice cream, it melts. So you're left with nothing. These goods too, either by the passage of time or whatever, they were losing value, and consequently, they didn't serve as a reserve of value. And for that problem, the metallic currencies appear, either gold, silver, or copper. The more, and there you already have the three functions of money. I'm not going to go into the discussion of when money, paper, and all those things appear, because I'm going to get tense. But what I'm interested in noticing in this, which is the most important from my point of view, is that the demand for money is a derived demand. I mean, no one demands money because they do. No one is planning to take the money that comes to mind for a wooden seat. No one is thinking about that. In fact, inheritance is a miscalculation. So, in other words, therefore the demand for money is a derived demand. It's a clear demand of what's happening on the real side. Now, notice that if I put it in these terms, the demand for money, us, at every moment of time, it's a function of consumption. In other words, nothing is pushing the income and the interest rate, which is a miscalculation. And I'm going to explain it now too, because if I put everything on the road of consumption, and that's going to be given me the demand for money at every moment of time, and I work on a model of general equilibrium. At this moment, I'm working in normal conditions of pressure and temperature. Let's say, how they do to kill an elephant, little by little. Well, I don't care. In essence, if you look at a model of general equilibrium, the functions of its system, what they depend on, the final distance of Robert Lakers Jr., human peace of mind, called the parameters. That is, it depended on preferences, technology, and donations. If you want, you can put an additional element honoring the Nobel Prize that were recently known. Let's say, put the system of property to include institutions. That said, that vector is constant. And if that factor is constant, naturally, the consequence is that the rate of consumption is granitic. That is, you graph. If you want, you solve it, let's say, applying the principle of the maximum of Pontryagin. If you want to solve it, you can do it discreetly. You also apply it as you wish. Or, I don't know, Isopelin, by whatever you can think of. Or Chow, if you want to solve it, by the method of Lagrange, whatever you want. But let's say that path is a rock, and therefore, the demand for money is granitic, because it is a mirror of that. That is, because what he needs is conditions. Therefore, in normal conditions, the demand for money should be something granitic. Notice that everyone is so stupid. The classics were not, when they elaborate the first rudimentary versions of the quantitative theory, where they say that the demand for money is a constant proportion as the income. In other words, that was not so crazy. In fact, the problem is that a function of demand for money is inconsistent with a general balance model because the prices in the general balance model are homogeneous of degree 0, and this would be homogeneous of degree 1, and due to some inconsistencies in the functioning of the system, but so crazy, so stupid they were not. So, in normal conditions of pressure and temperature, as well as path of consumption, the path of consumption is fixed. Then the demand for money should also be fixed. The real demand for money, and there has to be the same as the real balance, that is, the nominal amount, divided by the price level. Therefore, see that the price level is determined by the quotient between the money supply and the real demand for money, and where the only thing the central bank can do when it includes the money is to determine the nominal scale of the economy. That is, from there also the question of the nominal anchor, that is, the amount of money is what ends up generating the idea of the nominal anchor, which is to determine the price level. And obviously, that's if the demand for money is given. If I increase the money supply, the consequence is that the acquisitive power of the currency has to fall, that is, the prices rise. That is the situation where inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon generated by an excess of money supply, either because the supply rises or because the demand falls. In this case, the D parameters did not change. They would not have to change, and consequently that leads to a loss of the acquisitive power of money, and all the prices of monetary units rise. Basically, that is the central thesis, and where it comes from. Naturally, if one thinks in these times, now, to be thinking about this, we are not going to be doing a seminar or anything like that, especially because we can be doing all the nice math, and then there are the orcs. The orcs come and talk about the square of the circle, about the Virgin Meritres, and all those things. So, this, let's say, the consequences. Well, what do we think in terms of monetary policy? Well, you have two ways to raise the problem. One with exogenous money, and another with endogenous money. One way to think about this problem is, in the exogenous money, is by fixing the amount of money. Therefore, when you fix the amount of money, automatically what you are fixing is, in some sense, the price level of that is. It is accommodated to the conditions of the general equilibrium system on the real side, and the price level is determined. Obviously, I am working with functions that are homogeneous, of degree CL, not of degree 1. I mean, it is not strictly like the old quantitative theory. In that sense, what happens if I fix the amount of money? The natural consequence is that if now, to that factor of preferences, the nations and technology and property, you allow there to be technological progress, let's say, technological progress that you could describe exogenically. I mean, after the real life is more complicated, the consequence of that would be that he would have an economy that expands, that grows, and therefore that economy would generate deflation. I mean, that would be an economy where if the amount of money is constant and you have more and more transactions and more demand of money, the opposite of that, if M is fixed, you should have a deflation. I warn you that the problem of deflation is a problem in modern literature, because if you go to literature prior to the 20th century or in the 19th century and later, also this was not something that was discussed. There is a wonderful book about Philippe Bagus which is called Defending Deflation, and it was not a problem. It is a modern problem because we're used to living with inflation, and also those who think that it is a problem, what they are doing is insulting the private sector. I mean, it is not my fault that a policymaker is so stupid that he does not understand that I can make contracts in real terms and neutralize them in terms of inflation. In fact, one of the things that we did with deficit zero is that precisely the tax policy moves according to income and therefore to inflation and what happens with the level of activity. The others, a monetary row, I mean, he set a way in which the amount of money grows so that there is no deflation, because basically in the previous case there will be deflation, even that the amount of money does not grow and the economy grows, the deflation will be in line with the growth as economy. The other is to set a growth at the rate of the amount of money, and that, unlike what happens with the rate of growth, will determine the rate of inflation. This again, in terms of pressure and temperature, when we start to put things in, it starts to move a lot more. But the interesting thing is that they would have another pattern, let's say, of deflation. The reality is there, and he sets that rate. And why? Again, and we are going to find ourselves back with the issue of the fatal arrogance. The first question is, why is it bad that there is deflation? If deflation is a way of, let's say, it's like a return of income, to the rest of the population is obviously against the state. That is very good. But not only that, but also, if I am going to set, why am I going to set a sum what? Why am I going to set it? Because the reality is that if I set the amount of money, then you tell me, no, but I have some guys who are so great that they're going to set the amount of money according to what people want. And if people can do it, why do I need a third party? That people choose their own money and that they determine the amount of money according to what they want, and that's it. Then the central bank expands, causes harm. If it contracts, causes harm. And if it leaves the amount constant, it also causes harm. It always causes harm. The issue is how much harm it causes. The way less harm it causes is if it does not mirror the amount of money. This is another discussion. This is a scheme of monetary policy. The other scheme of monetary policy is the models of endogenous money. Without a doubt, the best known, the most popular, is in which the type of change is fixed. Yes, in what would be, in the terminology of Julia Hippolyta Guillemot Oliver, in his works about passive money. I think the translation is about passive money, but there he talks about what is called the external pattern, which is when you fix the type of change. Now, when you go to the case of an open economy, back to a very simplified model, you have the parity of the purchasing power, that the local prices are equal to the type of change by international prices. Now, if I am fixing the type of change, and I am a small economy, that means that the local prices are determined. So if I am determined, and if my relationship of the real amount of money, that is M over B, is equal to L, which is fixed, and now I have outside T, then what is determined? In an endogenous way is M. That is, the amount of money of the economy is determined in an endogenous way, depending on what is happening in inflationary meta outside, or what is happening with the demand of money. That is, if I increase the demand of money, for example, I will end up expending the amount of money. This is not less, because I could say that then the monetary base is equal to the reserves plus the domestic credit. And then if I increase the domestic credit, I lose reserves. This seems like a pretty silly thing, but Kaiser Marx did not learn it. As a consequence of this, let's say when they start losing reserves, then they start controlling capital. But the important thing is to see that the money is now determined in an endogenous way, because given P, which is given by PPP, given L, which is given by the mirror to man, associated with the intertemporal consumption path, that is where I get the amount of money, so that this can map. Naturally, there are other mechanisms to think about this problem, which are, let's say, this is one of the many. One is the mercantile pattern. Notice that the mercantile pattern in some way has some resemblance to this. With a mercantile pattern has a subversion, let's say, a phase also linked, which is what is called the salary pattern. I mention this case because it is often talked about the distribution push models. So you now determine the price level as a markup and the labor cost of productivity. So that way, the prices are determined and the amount of money should accommodate that. So when the distribution push appears, then the problem is that this distribution push suddenly manifests itself in a high price level, and that higher price level requires that there be monetary validation so as not to pay them in terms of activity. Basically, now the problem is that model, which suddenly the others don't necessarily have to have. is the fact that I have a problem with the theory of value. Because again, I'm saying that prices are a markup on the costs. Why I can say this, it is a labor cost to raise the distribution push. And the problem with us is that we are working with an objective theory of value. And we already know that the objective theory of value was annihilated. Therefore, everything that has to do with acts of brutality, like with the Soviet and gender debt, which had people controlling prices, then they believed that by adding the costs from there, let's say, the price level, and then they were determining who the bad guys were. They remember the former president saying they're devils. Well, the forces of heaven killed them. And then, thank you, Daria. And then the other model of what Oliver called the credit pattern, what was effective, setting the interest rate. Basically, there is a problem there because now you are not determining the amount of money and you are not determining the price level. In other words, you have the problem of what is called the nominal anchor. In other words, by not being fixed to M, you cannot determine P. Frequently, the system is like the derivative, and that is why inflation expectations are so important. Why? Because that allows them to link the future prices with the present prices. It allows them to determine P, and from there, to determine M, and from there, to solve the model. The truth is that, to me, let's say, this of controlling the interest rate seems like an aberration. I remember everyone knows about my admiration, affection in all the definitions they can have, but as we are friends, I can tell the story with Father Stelzenaker when he decides to switch to inflation targeting. So I asked him what he thought of Mona. He said, a caveman. If you want to serve him, don't worry, no problem. I mean, all the time, I campaigned that I had to leave. So if you want to say whatever you want, I'm not going to deny it. Having said that, obviously, we all have a pretty bad opinion of Monero, especially because he has a bad theory of value. He believes that prices are determined by costs. I mean, this is very important. One of the things that Menger preached in his Principles of Political Economy in 1871, and that later Van Wieser wrote, is what he calls the principle of imputation, where the prices determine the costs and not the costs that determine the prices. It's so ridiculous to believe that the cost determine the prices, that if this were the case, there would be no breaks. There would be no sense either to be efficient. A total, let's say, I will be able to transfer the cost. I mean, it's something that really doesn't make any sense. But if you want to see the whole discussion about the theory of the value of work and the subjective theory of value, that's not how it has been with these kinds of things. And why is it a band? To control the rate of interest, because to transfer the rate of interest is equivalent to the controls made by Mono, but also intertemporally. Because in the end, what is the rate of interest? The rate of interest doesn't exist because money exists. I mean, this is an criticism of Mr. John Maynard Keynes. In general theory, strictly speaking, the rate of interest doesn't exist because money exists. The rate of interest exists because time exists. The rate of interest has to do with the rate of intertemporal preference. I mean, it's a difference within preferences. Therefore, in reality, the rate of interest is the relative price of future goods with respect to the present goods. Or why do you think that when the rate of interest rises, saving rises? Because what is saving? Saving is the future consumption. So if I'm raising the rate of interest, the present price is rising. If the present price rises, I replaced present consumption with the future consumption. That's why you see that when the rate of interest rises, the saving rises. But in reality, I say, go to microeconomics and the intertemporal chapter and show you this problem of relative prices and the rate of interest. I mean, you don't have to be very sophisticated or sell the problem of dynamic optimization. When you see the utility consciousness and the rate of interest, obviously the rate of time preference appears. Find that precisely the same conditions are the same as if you have prices. Having said this, then it is an aberration, wanting to control the rate of interest, because it implies being so arrogant that not only wanting to control the present prices, but also the future. It is like being a Monero reloaded. It is the incredible version of Hop from Monero. Therefore, I am not a supporter of controlling the rate of interest. Given that we have a central bank, for now, we will control the amount of money. It doesn't matter because Santiago and Vladimir are also brilliant. They're going to get work from something else, but they have done a huge service to the country the day we leave this work in. We have finished with this preface called Central Bank. It is like the frog and the scorpion. So ask it to change. So, having said this, we had even this theoretical discussion. We had to face the problem that we had to stop the hyper. So, we had 3 expansion factors at the base. One is what's called by public sector, which is to finance a tax deficit. Another is by financial sector, and another is by external sector. When we decided to make deficit zero, basically it is a way to cut with the monetary mission to finance the tax. If you take the ceremony methodology for 1901, until today, Argentina had 23 crises. Of those 23 crises, 21 have fiscal origin, where the tax deficit can be large or extravagantly large. The extravagantly large cases are the case, for example, at the Rodriguez with 14 points, or the PBI in 1975. The tablita would change in 1982 with 11 points of the PBI. The hyperinflation of Alfonsine with 8% in 1989. The convertibility in 2001 with 7. Well, we, in the consolidated, had 15. To have a magnitude order, nothing more. In that sense, it was fundamental to cut the tax deficit, and from there, the deficit zero to end the tax emission. Now, in what had to do with the tax quota, we had 3 sources, and we achieved that. In the first month, to close the tax gap, we had to end with the paid passives, because the problem of paid passives was not a minor issue, because what generated us was more tax deficit and more. That is, it increased the amount of future money, because in the end, all those paid passes were future emission, therefore they were future inflation. So basically, we had to cut that way in at those paid pesos that were generating deficit by 10 points of the PBI. I made, let's say, that the economy truly was a quake. And here, let's say, it is important to have this discussion, because many economists suggested that this was stopped by raising the interest rate. And if we had raised the interest rate, today we would not be talking about how we stabilize, but we would have been talking in the last period of the Cali trade. We would have been talking about the relationship. Today, the paid passes would probably be 10-1 with a monetary base. We would be discussing one hyperinflation is or when that position of titles would be expropriated. Therefore, if someone is a supporter of the interest rate, I want to tell you that we have promoted at least a defeat that we did, let's say, not using the interest rate as a mechanism, because if we had used the interest rate, if we had said what that International Monetary Fund and what many local economists said today, we were in hyperinflation. What we did was something else. Basically, in the face of the change of imbalance, we made a correction where the type of change was closer to the market. This is very important because what went down was excess of money. That is, when you generate the money overhang, how do you generate the money overhang? The money overhang is generated because you have the type of fixed change. You are emitting money. You start to raise reserves, you put the controls, and with that does is artificially increase the demand for money to charge them inflationary taxes. That is, not only is a violent, and it is the lie of inflation, which is an unregulated tax, but they're also forcing them to demand more cases by force, to charge them more inflationary taxes. This is a total reality. But apart from that, what is the most interesting of this situation? That if we had done what they said, first we would be in an inflationary outbreak, but not only that, by taking the type of change to a number similar to that of the market, when they corrected by tax country, what we did was shrink the excess demand of the currency market. So we shrank the excess supply in the rest of the economy. So shrinking the excess supply in the stock market meant that the interest rate was falling, so the risk of the country fell. Shrinking the excess supply in the goods market meant that the drop in activity was not so much, and therefore the level of employment did not fall so much, and therefore that is why we made the biggest tax adjustment in the history of humanity. If I take nation and central bank, and yet there was no social problem. There is a part of the program that has to deal with the social policy made from human capital, but it would be an extra, and I don't want to bother you with my presentation. So, in that sense, see how interesting, because the other day, Jose Luis Daza explained, he says, the characteristic of this program is that while all the other experiments of similar characteristics involved drops in the GDP around 10%, is today you look at the July data of AMI, the station compared to December, the drop is 0.6. If you look at industrial production, they are at the same levels as November. If you look at what we did, for example, in 2002, the GDP dropped 10.9%, but in the second quarter, which is when the adjustment occurs, it dropped 16%. Look, if the Minister of Economy is not a giant that I have, but with the social consequences that this has, that is, having thought about that problem of where we put it, type of change, because we could not open under the libertarian logic. It meant to look for a market proxy that would shrink to the maximum the excess of demand. At the same time, one of the things that was happening is that I remember that when we achieved the CFR habit in the month of January, they told us that it was a coincidence. They told us that the second time it was a coincidence. Well, there came a time when they realized that the tax commitment was 3. They seek up by having 18 ministries. We took them to 8. We made a lot of cuts of public employees. We completely eliminated the public work. We completely eliminated the discretionary transfers to provinces. And obviously there were also parties that had a mechanism of adjustment that were leaked, that later were recomposed. and yet the tax numbers are here. So that allowed to show that the deficit era policy was working, and that it was working seriously, and deficit zero implies that I am not taking new debt. That is, I can be rolling the debt, but I am not taking new debt. In fact, I tell you that in the last 40 years, a single government lowered the debt in a non-compulsive way, not with cuts in the renegotiations, us $20,000 million. And as this was happening, what does it mean? It means that the debt-product relationship is not growing. Therefore, it means that they are intertemporarily solvent. Consequently, that also explains the fall of the country's risk. Today, the country's risk ended in 1047. It is the lowest level in the last 5 years. In fact, when we were discussing the topic of universities, because more than anything, because of what it implies in terms of giving the fiscal deficit, one of the things that we did with Federico was to ask his team to estimate the impact of the country's risk on the PBI in dollars. And if we, with this level of country's risk, we are in a PBI of 600 billion, that is $600,000 million. If we go back to a country's risk of 3,000, the PBI goes to $400,000 million. Therefore, 1/3 of the PBI would be lost, or we would have 50% more PBI in the case of the 3,000 basic points. That is, it is not a minor issue. In terms of PBI per capita, it is not a minor issue. In terms of the discussion of universities, where at no time the public university, and no time that it does non-arrangement, because there is nothing free. There is nothing like a free lunch. But what happens if we go back to the steps and go to a country's risk of 3,000 because we start to give in? I recommend the book Histories of the Fifth Floor, about how, let's say, the government of Alfonsina starts to give in to the pressures and ends up in the hyper. So in that context, if we do not negotiate, there is more. If you go to a country's risk of 3,000 amount of dollars that go to the university are the same, but the difference is that I have a low PBI per capita. A low is like that fall of the PBI. A third goes into activity, but 2/3 is buying, jump in the type of real change. That implies that it also increases the number of poor and destitute. And we are not going to tolerate the deprecal with respect to tax equilibrium. And we are not going to tolerate that similar damage on the Argentinians, say, for a group of criminals who do not want to be audited. Fortunately, today the dictum came out and we're going to be able to audit them. Churros are in danger. And as we advance in tax equilibrium, that's where this giant came in, which is here, Dr. Pablo Cornell, and he starts to put the debt in the place where it always had to be. That debt was debt of the national state. It was debt of the treasury. That is what was going on. There was a tax deficit. They were looking for some money to send money. That money went into the street, and then they wanted to externalize it on the other side by paying taxes with that province that was in the deficit. A tax equilibrium, in reality, was not to be sincere with the treasury accounts. And as we showed our commitment to tax equilibrium, apart from that jump in the valuation, is implied that what we needed was to audit the rate in dollars. that implied a real interest rate in negative weights, which also allowed us to liquefy the paid passes and, on the other hand, take it to the treasury. And what nobody was talking about, and what everyone was saying, was that it was impossible to solve between this giant, which is Santiago Borsali and Pablo Cornell. They fixed it in 7 months. Look, I'm not going to be proud of my team. Naturally, then came the discussion. I mean, you know that discussion. We, at that time, had started to discuss. It's a speech in which I'm in the Buenos Aires Stock Exchange, and I'm talking about excess of zero offer. Basically, what I was saying there was that we were only going to issue by external sector, because if you notice, when we were talking about endogenous money, in the case of external patronage, you only increase the amount of money against demand of money. That would be the argument. So that money doesn't generate loss of the power of money acquisition. I mean, that doesn't generate inflation. Now, we realize that we wrote on the truth is that. Why? Because that is a free system, but this is not in the textbooks either. So let's say, because of that self-flagellating issue that I have, my friend Alejandro Rosisner told me, but is it in them? Textbooks? No. So what are you sorry about? Well, but one, let's say, has a thing of, let's say, perfectionism. And what we realize is that exporters so Dalif was not exactly wanting to demand pesos, because let's say in the traditional model you have an operation in places that you want to do, you take dollars, with those dollars you buy the pesos, and with those pesos you make the transaction. So that demand of money is mapped against a transactional demand, and that doesn't generate problems in terms of the purchasing power of money. Now, what is the problem? The problem is that when I have control of capital and I am forcing them to liquidate the dollars, I am buying pesos, but I don't want all those pesos. And the consequence is that now pesos are left over and inflation is generated. So from that moment, we decide to face a very complex situation. And that, let's say, there was a whole idea that the type of change was already going that Monday to you, 2,000 pesos. Wait, remember that with Toto we were traveling to what was my presentation in Sinval. And there, let's say with Toto and with Santiago, let's say by video, we decided to change the scheme of monetary policy and go directly to mission zero. We knew that we were at risk, that they would attack us anyway, but we had the firm conviction that if we didn't modify the amount of money, sooner or later we were going to win the market. Today, the type of change is in 1150, and it is one of the economic tides. So, the point is, what have we achieved? Well, what we have achieved is that the wholesale inflation is 2.1%. That is, we went from 17,000 to 28%. If you want the consumer inflation of 1,500, we went to 30%. But the most interesting is that by design of policy, there is a part of inflation that is induced inflation that has to do with the agreed evaluation rate of international inflation. I'm going to round it down to 2.5, but it's a little less today. So if my last data of IPC is 3.5, it means that the real inflation as a program, the real monetary inflation that the program is generating is 1 point. That is, if I take out the crawling and let's say automatically that 2.5 disappears, and therefore I have only 1 point of inflation left. It means that inflation today, the inflation of the program is traveling to 13% per year. That is, if you take it in terms of the Puerton, let's say if you correct by the changing pattern, you're going to have to talk about levels of inflation that oscillate between 13% and 25%. And why is this important? Because this miracle in terms of the inflation, we achieved it without hyperinflation. In general, let's say, the 2 previous successful programs, there was a strong inflationary process before that involved a strong liquefaction of the real balance, and consequently, there was not much more to the demand for money to fall, and therefore, let's say it would be much easier to stabilize. We did it without expropriation. That's where I often find it funny when they told us, no, well, what day are you going to do these things? I say they don't understand. I'm not a communist. I'm not a director. I don't believe in that of setting prices, setting wages, setting interest rates, sector policies. No, I'm a liberal. And the only thing I can do as a liberal is that my economic program has a fiscal policy, deficit zero, a monetary policy, emission zero, and the type of change that is still not free until I finish correcting the imbalance of stocks. And this is also important. In addition, we did not control prices. We did not control the type of change. And in addition, we did a recomposition of relative prices. Today, the prices of the regulated ones already cover 80% of the price of the cost. That is to say, something that seems like a minor issue, but it is not. So, and with all that, we managed to lower inflation, and it is in a range, if you want, from 13 to 25. So, how does this continue? I mean, when do I get out of this? Well, look, time is gas. I don't know when the time is, but all these operations that we were doing were made on the market, and being made on the market means that it will depend on the decision of the agents. Now, the most interesting thing is that when the observed inflation tends to induced inflation, what happens? The inflation disappears. And if the inflation disappears, it means that the money overhand disappears. As the money overhand disappears, inflation will appear to the induced inflation. The types of changes converge. The inflation rate converges. And as I solve a problem of stocks, when it becomes zero, the money overhand disappears, and when the money overhand disappears, there is no excess of weight supply. And if there is no excess of weight supply, I can open the stock market, even when it doesn't have dollars, because I go to a flexible type of change system. Obviously, it will depend on how the agents are generating this dynamic until the inflation of the program disappears. I mean, if it is only induced, the controls, obviously, that while that happens, we will end up solving the problems of the stocks, because that dynamic does not happen independently of what is happening with the rest of the stocks. And that day we open the stock market. When? I don't know, but it will happen when all their set of conditions is given. Having said this, the point is how this continues, because the question is, okay, we have set a Y monetary base, and the observed monetary base, let's say the traditional one, the traditional format is growing, but that is growing according to what? I mean, for example, how is the disarmament of the FEs, and so on? I suppose you have a company. When you see that the demand is being recovered, When you see that the demand is being recovered, what are you going to do? Are you going to lose market position? Or are you going to leave the money market? You are going to leave the money market. When you leave the money market, the bank has to give you the money. When they have to give you the money, they turn around and tell the bank to ask the state to pay the fees. So what do you have there? You have an endogenous expansion of the amount of money. For what? To finance the movement of activity. In parallel, what is going to happen is that when the money overhand disappears, what is going to end up disappearing? The difference between the traditional and the wide monetary base. And from that moment on, the amount of money is fixed. So the question is, well, okay, once we get to that, let's say the money overhand is eliminated. The base definitions are mapped. The types of changes have converged. The interest rates have converged. So now it's open. How does it continue? Well, assuming that the economy is going to grow, and I have serious arguments to believe that it is going to grow. I mean, either because of the structural reforms that imply a jump in the indices of the economic freedom of 90 positions. And today we have institutions that begin to appear, despite the fiscal degenerates. They begin to appear more in Germany. That safens Italy. And maybe that doesn't satisfy me, I warn you. I mean, I want Argentina to be in the freest country in the world. Therefore, that implies that a PBI. In fact, I saw part of Juan Pablo Nicolina's presentation. Shine, precisely, the issue of greed. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, the PBI doubles in 10 years, which implies a growth rate of 7% per capita. That, let's say, on the one hand. On the other hand, guys, I mean, we've just saved and returned to the people 15 points of the PBI, a little bit with the country tax, but we've already returned it. And now in December, we've definitely taken it out. I mean, the first time we said that transitory tax was raised, and we fulfilled it and we took it out. And now, let's say, at the end of the year, we've also eliminated it. In addition, the continuous decrease is going to involve lower discount rates. I mean, look at everything that the Argentinian financial assets have raised. Well, if you think in terms of Kier of Tubin, let's say the market value is much higher than that of opposition. Here comes a fury of investments, and not to mention what has to do with Ricky, which has announced more than $50 billion of investments. But not only that, but also that there are issues that boost short-term demand. And notice that today, the data of installed capacity has already increased by 61.3%. I mean, there is a recovery of demand, and that's because 5 months in a row that the real wage and real-term rentals have been rising. Yes, and also, we had to reverse the stock cycle. Therefore, let's say we have elements, conjunctural, whether it is the recomposition of salaries and rentals in real times, as the reversal of the stock cycle, more structural factors that have to do with Riggy, that have to do with the increase in savings within the economy, with the decrease of the country's risk, and the structural reforms. Therefore, let's say, when we become aware of maintaining this direction, 10, 20, 30 years in sight, we will be talking about the Argentine miracle. Thank you very much.